The Princess of Wales pledged herself to serve her country and her people, and to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation. She set an example of selfless duty, a different future, full of hope for all people.
On a night when Buckingham Palace should have glowed with the calm rhythm of tradition, a single explosive declaration shattered the silence. "She's the Queen now," King Charles's voice thundered through gilded halls, shaking not just the walls of the palace, but the very foundation of the monarchy itself. What drove Charles to strip Camilla of power in front of the court and elevate Catherine, the Princess of Wales, as the true Queen of Britain's future? Those present remember the sharp intake of breath, the ripple of shock that coursed through the room like a storm. It wasn't the sort of phrase meant to be spoken in such an unguarded, unyielding tone. Yet Charles said it not once, but twice, as though determined to hammer it into history. The ballroom, dressed in velvet grandeur, suddenly became a stage for betrayal. Courtiers froze, glasses half raised, eyes darting between the king, the stunned Camilla by his side, and the poised Catherine, who stood motionless yet unshaken. Gasps escaped the mouths of those closest to the throne. The heavy silence that followed was not just awkward, it was suffocating, a silence that carried centuries of royal history and the weight of one man's irreversible choice. Those who had served under Queen Elizabeth knew they were witnessing something that broke with every carefully guarded rule of monarchy. A king who had cast aside convention to crown another, while his queen consort still stood in the room. For Camilla, the words cut deeper than any blade. She had endured decades of ridicule, clawed her way to legitimacy, and finally worn the crown she believed secured her place. But in that instant, Charles's voice stripped her of authority, relegating her reign to memory. Her eyes widened, not in disbelief but in raw recognition of what had just occurred. She had been dethroned, not by formal decree, but by the merciless truth of a king's public words. Catherine, however, did not flinch. She did not speak, nor did she move, yet her silence filled the room more than any cry of protest could. It was a silence of acceptance, of quiet command, as though she had anticipated this moment all along. Her gaze was steady, her demeanor unbroken, and those who watched felt an almost magnetic pull toward her presence. It wasn't just Charles who had crowned her, it was the collective recognition of every eye in that room, suddenly seeing her not merely as a princess, but as the monarch's chosen successor in spirit and in strength. The whispers began almost instantly. Advisors leaned into each other, exchanging hurried murmurs about what the declaration truly meant. Some speculated Charles had revealed a long-held plan, while others feared it was the result of failing health, clouding judgment. Whatever the cause, one truth was undeniable. Catherine had just been elevated to a position that no speechwriter, no document, no coronation had yet granted her. In that moment, she became something more than the future queen consort. She became the living symbol of the monarchy's next era, and as the echoes of Charles's words settled into the gilded walls, those closest to power understood something few dared to admit aloud. This wasn't a sudden outburst. It wasn't born in a single night of impulse. This was the culmination of years, perhaps decades, of shifting loyalties, careful maneuvering, and unspoken tensions. Behind the grandeur of titles and the polish of ceremony, a hidden war for influence had been waged, and tonight, it had reached its breaking point. But to understand how Charles reached this point of no return, we must first uncover the secret tensions and hidden forces that have been brewing behind palace walls for decades. She entered the royal family as an outsider, a commoner stepping into the glare of the crown. Yet Catherine's every smile, every speech, every calculated silence was part of a transformation few could see until it was too late. While the world adored her as the perfect princess, behind closed doors, she was quietly building the foundations of power. In the early years, she was underestimated, dismissed by critics as too ordinary for the extraordinary life she had married into. The weight of public scrutiny bore down on her. The comparisons to Diana relentless, the whispers of whether she was strong enough to endure. Behind her graceful composure lay private doubts, moments when she questioned whether she could truly survive the storm of monarchy, much less shape it. Yet instead of crumbling, Catherine adapted. She observed, she learned, and she began to master the game few outsiders had ever played successfully. Her calm public image was not just charm, it was armor. To the world, she appeared serene, modest, and dutiful, but beneath that carefully constructed exterior was a strategist's mind, one that rarely revealed itself openly. Every engagement she attended, every speech she gave, every cause she championed was chosen with precision, not for the fleeting applause of a crowd, but for the enduring influence it carried within the palace. By the time her critics realized she was more than a smiling figure at William's side, she had already secured a quiet authority that would one day rival the crown itself. Her ascent was not built on isolation but on alliances, subtle, strategic relationships forged with those who moved unseen through the machinery of the monarchy. Palace aides who once reported to Charles found themselves drawn to her steadiness, her ability to listen without judgment, her knack for inspiring loyalty without demanding it. Diplomats who dined at royal banquets noticed her grasp of global affairs and her ability to diffuse tension with a single remark. Slowly, she was weaving a web of trust that extended beyond Britain's borders, earning the respect of leaders who would later amplify her influence in ways the monarchy had never foreseen. It was during Charles's moments of vulnerability, however, that Catherine's role truly began to shift. When illness cast shadows over the king's reign, she was the steady hand he leaned on. When doubts about public opinion plagued him, it was Catherine's reassurance that kept his resolve intact. What began as a daughter-like presence grew into something more significant. She became his confidant, his strategist, the one figure he could rely on without fear of betrayal. In private chambers where titles meant little and trust meant everything, Charles began to see in Catherine not just a princess of Wales, but the monarchy's shield and compass. Her causes became her battlegrounds, each one carefully chosen to reflect not just kindness, but command. Championing mental health was not simply compassion, it positioned her as the voice of a modern monarchy. Advocating for children gave her a platform rooted in empathy, yet powerful enough to outshine rivals. Even her environmental initiatives aligned seamlessly with Charles's lifelong passions, cementing her as not just his ally, but his extension. To the public, she became the people's queen, not by coronation, but by recognition. Every hand she shook, every heartfelt speech she delivered, built a bond with the nation that neither Charles nor Camilla could match. Those watching closely began to see the outlines of a future that could not be denied. Catherine was no longer the quiet wife of a prince, she was a force reshaping the monarchy itself. Insiders whispered that Charles's trust in her had evolved into something larger, that he had already begun to envision her as the one who could hold the institution together when his strength inevitably faltered. It was never formally stated, yet those within the palace walls understood. Catherine was being prepared, piece by piece, to inherit more than a crown. She was being positioned as the monarchy's savior. But Catherine's ascent could only come at someone else's fall, and Camilla's reign was already cracking from within. Camilla once stood as Charles's unwavering partner, the woman who had fought against decades of public hatred to finally wear the crown. Yet the very throne she secured became the one that betrayed her. Stripped of influence, her title now little more than a shell, Camilla's downfall was as swift as it was devastating. For years she had endured whispers, survived scandals, and carved her place beside Charles through resilience and sheer determination. She believed she had won the war of perception, that time had softened the nation's disdain, and that her place was secure. But in truth, her crown was never entirely hers. It was borrowed, fragile, and weighed down by the ghosts of the past. The cracks began quietly. Staff inside the palace, once loyal, began murmuring their frustrations. They described her leadership style as aloof, even dismissive, contrasting sharply with Catherine's warmth and inclusivity. Aides felt overlooked, their advice ignored, their loyalty unrewarded. Where Catherine inspired devotion through listening and connection, Camilla often left distance in her wake, fueling the sense that her reign was detached. In corridors where silence once reigned, discontent began to echo louder than loyalty, and every whisper was a warning sign of the collapse to come. Beyond the palace gates, the contrast was even more striking. Catherine's popularity soared with each public appearance, her every gesture embraced as proof of her compassion. Camilla, by comparison, struggled to ignite that same affection. While she fulfilled her duties with diligence, the people never embraced her as their queen in heart. To many, she remained the shadow of Diana's pain, an unwelcome reminder of wounds that time had not fully healed. The more Catherine rose, the more Camilla seemed to fade, as though the crown itself rejected her in favor of the younger, more beloved figure at Charles's side. Charles himself began to see the widening gulf. Insiders whispered of his growing frustration with Camilla's resistance to modernization. She preferred the comforts of tradition, the safety of old ways, while Charles yearned for a monarchy that could adapt to survive. Her reluctance clashed with his vision, leaving him impatient, even resentful. Slowly, the king who had once defended her against the world began to view her as an obstacle rather than a partner. The trust that had bound them weakened, and in its place grew the unspoken certainty that her reign could not carry the monarchy forward. For Camilla, the toll was crushing. She had once walked with confidence, sure of her place, but now she felt the ground slipping beneath her feet. Every reduction of her duties, every shift of authority toward Catherine chipped away at her spirit. Once proud, she now felt diminished, sidelined, watching helplessly as her influence shrank before her eyes. It wasn't just a loss of power, it was a loss of identity, a stripping away of everything she had fought for. The woman who had weathered storms of scandal and ridicule now faced a humiliation she could not overcome. Irrelevance. The cruelest moment came not in private but in public, when Charles openly favored Catherine over her. His words, his gestures, his acknowledgement of Catherine's growing authority, all of it played out before cameras and courtiers alike. To the world, it was a symbolic passing of power. To Camilla, it was betrayal laid bare. She stood in the shadow of her husband's choice, not just dethroned but replaced, and the sting of that revelation was a wound that would never heal. But Charles's shocking declaration wasn't just a betrayal, it was a calculated move, one rooted in health, legacy, and a battle for the monarchy's survival. Behind the grandeur of the crown, Charles carried out a secret battle, his health declining, his reign overshadowed by time. Each private doctor's visit and whispered prognosis became a comfortant, ticking clock in his mind. And as the clock ticked louder, his fear grew. Would history remember him as a weak monarch, or as the king who secured the future by handing power to the one woman Britain already saw as their true queen? The weight of the throne grew heavier with every passing day, not because of the crown itself, but because of the shadow of mortality creeping ever closer. In the solitude of late nights at Clarence House, he often sat with memories of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and asked himself whether he had lived up to her legacy or whether he had allowed the monarchy to weaken under his watch. The truth gnawed at him. Elizabeth had been a towering figure, steady and unyielding through decades of upheaval. Charles, however, was already viewed by many as a transitional monarch, a placeholder between giants. The thought tormented him. He did not want to be remembered as the king who merely inherited, but as the king who made the monarchy unshakable again. Yet his body betrayed him. Fatigue lingered, treatments continued, and every consultation with physicians left him haunted by the same question: how much time did he really have left? In these moments of despair, Catherine emerged not merely as a daughter-in-law, but as his anchor. When his spirit faltered, she offered calm reassurance. When doubt clouded his judgment, she presented clarity. It was not the rehearsed diplomacy of a consort, it was genuine strength, a quiet force that restored him when he felt most fragile. The bond they shared grew beyond duty, beyond family ties. It resembled a father-daughter closeness, one built on mutual respect and trust. She became the one person he could speak to without fear of criticism, the one voice he believed when she reminded him that the monarchy could still have a future. Camilla, though loyal, could not fill that role. Her presence reminded him of battles fought in the past, not victories to come. She was steady, But she was not the beacon of reassurance the institution needed. Where Catherine radiated renewal and hope, Camilla carried the weight of history's judgments that Charles knew would never fully fade. And in his mind, the contrast was undeniable. If the monarchy were to stand strong after him, it would not be through Camilla's influence but through Catherine's ability to inspire a nation. Within private meetings, advisors whispered the truth that Charles already knew but had not yet spoken. Again and again, Catherine's name surfaced as the figure who could safeguard the crown's future. Diplomats admired her composure, aides trusted her instinct, and the public adored her unwavering presence. These conversations, hushed and coded, only confirmed what his heart already decided. She was not just William's wife, she was the monarchy's lifeline. The pressure built like a storm. With each passing day, Charles felt the fragile balance tipping, the urgency mounting. He realized his reign would not be measured in decades, but in decisive acts. And so, with legacy at stake, Charles engineered the unthinkable. A coup within his own monarchy. One designed not for power, but for survival. Inside Buckingham Palace, betrayal was scripted in gold ink. Charles orchestrated a coup that wasn't fought with armies, but with signatures, speeches, and whispered decrees. By the time Camilla realized the walls were closing in, Catherine's crown had already been forged in silence. It was not the clash of swords or the roar of rebellion that reshaped the monarchy, but a quiet, calculated storm carried out in meeting rooms where loyalty was weighed against survival. Every move was deliberate, every step hidden beneath layers of secrecy, and each decision pushed Camilla further toward the edge of irrelevance. The plan began long before the public announcement. Behind velvet doors, Charles summoned his most trusted advisors, men and women who had guided the monarchy through crisis after crisis. With weary eyes and a trembling voice, he declared the need for a shift that would secure the institution's future, even if it meant breaking tradition. Drafts of confidential documents were drawn up, slowly cutting away Camilla's authority. Patronages she once controlled were reassigned. Responsibilities she had clung to were quietly passed to Catherine, and though Camilla remained blissfully unaware, the machinery of power was already moving against her. Certain members of the royal family were warned, their loyalty secured in advance. William was among the first, his support deemed essential. He did not argue. To him, Catherine's rise was both inevitable and just. Princess Anne, too, was brought into the fold, her pragmatism ensuring stability during the upheaval. But not everyone was consulted. Most notably, Camilla herself was left in the dark. While her husband prepared to strip her influence, she attended engagements, smiled for cameras, and continued believing her position remained untouchable. The cruelest aspect of this coup was not simply her loss of power, but the fact that she was the last to know it had already slipped away. Meanwhile, Catherine's public image was being carefully curated in preparation for what was to come. Every appearance was choreographed with precision. Her speeches echoed themes of unity. Her presence exuded strength. Her causes symbolized renewal. To the world, it seemed like a natural evolution of her role. To those inside the palace, it was a calculated build-up, a deliberate effort to prepare the nation for her ascension. By the time Charles's declaration came, the public would not be shocked at Catherine's new role. They would embrace it. The speech itself was the crown jewel of this silent rebellion. Standing before a gathering of courtiers, dignitaries, and aides, Charles spoke words that rang like a thunderclap. "She's the queen now." It was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to reverse. In that single moment, centuries of protocol shattered. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now shouted into history. Camilla, blindsided, stood powerless as her husband's voice echoed through the halls, sealing her fate with a sentence. Even the media had been carefully managed. Weeks before the announcement, quiet leaks had been fed to sympathetic journalists. Subtle hints suggested Catherine's increasing influence, priming the public to accept the truth when it came. By the time the words left Charles's lips, headlines were ready, narratives polished, and the nation braced. What seemed like a spontaneous declaration was, in reality, the final step in a meticulously crafted plan. Yet, even as Britain reeled, The shockwaves were far from contained. The fallout tore open old wounds within the royal family itself. As Catherine's crown gleamed brighter, two princes reacted in ways that revealed their deepest scars. William, torn between pride in his wife and sorrow for his stepmother. Harry, furious that once again the monarchy's ruthless machinery had destroyed another woman in his family. The brothers stood divided, as their mother's ghost haunted every corner of the palace. For William, Catherine's elevation was the culmination of years of support and shared ambition. He had always known her strength, her patience, her quiet determination. To see her recognized so publicly filled him with a sense of vindication. Yet pride came with pain, for in the same moment that Catherine rose, Camilla fell, and William could not ignore the humiliation that trailed in the shadows of his wife's triumph. This conflict weighed heavily on him. Outwardly, he celebrated Catherine's success, his face composed and resolute, but in the privacy of his thoughts, guilt lingered. Camilla had been part of his life for decades, a stepmother who had endured scorn to stand beside his father. Though their relationship was never effortless, William could not erase the image of her standing alone as Charles declared another woman the future of the monarchy. Catherine's gain felt tainted by Camilla's loss, and William struggled to reconcile his loyalty to both women. His silence became his shield, his emotions buried deep where few could see. Harry, on the other hand, had no such restraint. To him, the spectacle was an all-too-familiar tragedy. Watching Camilla stripped of power, humiliated by the very system she had served, awakened in him the old rage he carried from Diana's fate. He saw history repeating itself, the crown consuming another woman in its relentless hunger for survival. While William chose quiet contemplation, Harry erupted in private, his anger spilling into conversations with those closest to him. The monarchy, he believed, had learned nothing, and Catherine's rise, however deserved, was a reminder of the institution's cruelty. The tension between the brothers reached a breaking point in a phone call that began as a plea and ended as a confrontation. Harry accused William of standing by while another woman was sacrificed for the sake of the crown. William defended Catherine, insisting that this was not manipulation but recognition of her rightful place. Their voices rose, the conversation fractured, and for the first time since Diana's death, the bond that once united them cracked under the weight of opposing truths. They were no longer brothers aligned against the world. They were heirs, divided by it. Catherine found herself caught in the middle of this storm, torn between the man she married and the brother he once cherished. She longed to soothe the rift, but her very presence was the spark that fueled it. Every word she spoke in defense of her new role seemed to deepen Harry's resentment, while every silence was read as complicity. The fracture spread beyond the brothers themselves, touching every corner of the family as loyalty and resentment became lines drawn in invisible ink. And though the palace attempted to present a devastating, united front, the truth was far more fragile. This wound would not close easily. It festered beneath the surface, a reminder that power always exacts a cost, and that even triumph carries shadows of betrayal. The monarchy had crowned its future, but in doing so, it had divided its sons. But beyond family drama, the nation itself demanded answers, and Catherine's first moves as the new queen in power shocked everyone. The ink was barely dry on Charles's declaration when Catherine made her first stunning moves. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was a ruler, reshaping the monarchy's heartbeat in ways no one expected. And her first orders sent a clear message. A new era had begun, and it would not wait for permission. Where others might have hesitated, testing the waters of influence, Catherine struck with a clarity that startled even her closest allies. The days of quiet preparation were over. This was the moment she transformed from princess to sovereign power in all but name. Her first step was to seize control of the palace staff. Long loyal to Charles and, by duty, to Camilla, many were caught off guard when Catherine summoned them to a private gathering. There, she laid out her vision for a monarchy that would not bend under the weight of old traditions, but would stand tall against modern pressures. Staff who had once whispered doubts about her authority now found themselves answering directly to her. Within weeks, key figures shifted allegiances, not by force, but by recognizing that Catherine had become the true center of command. From there, she turned her focus to the crown's charitable foundations. Under her leadership, a sweeping reorganization began. Some projects were cut, others reshaped, and many redirected to causes that reflected her personal vision of children, mental health, and global sustainability. In one decisive stroke, she dismantled the lingering influence of Camilla's patronages, replacing them with initiatives tied unmistakably to her own name. It was bold, it was ruthless, and it was effective. Donors, leaders, and the press took notice. The monarchy was no longer anchored in the past, but carried by Catherine's hand. Her authority did not stop at home. Catherine's voice began reaching into the Commonwealth, where uncertainty over Charles's health and Camilla's reduced role had left many questioning the monarchy's stability. With carefully crafted speeches and calculated visits, she expanded her influence abroad, presenting herself as the steady figure who could unite not just Britain, but the entire Commonwealth. Leaders who once looked to Charles now turned to her, seeing in Catherine the same resolute confidence that had once defined Queen Elizabeth. But perhaps the boldest signal came not through policy but through symbolism. Appearing in public adorned with jewels tied to Diana, she reminded the world of the legacy that had shaped both William and herself. The gesture was not accidental, it was deliberate, a way of binding her rise to the memory of the woman the people had adored. It was a declaration that her crown was not borrowed but earned, carried on the shoulders of history and heartbreak. Behind closed doors, however, came the most chilling moment of all. Catherine confronted Camilla in private, a meeting that insiders describe as icy and unflinching. No shouting, no theatrics, just Catherine's unwavering tone and Camilla's silence heavy with defeat. Whatever words were spoken, the outcome was clear. Catherine would not yield, and Camilla had no room left to fight. The public embraced Catherine's authority with almost frightening speed. Crowds cheered her at appearances, newspapers hailed her as the monarchy's savior, and polls surged in her favor. To the nation, the choice was obvious. The people had chosen their queen, even if the coronation had not yet come. But Catherine's rise carried a shadow, because dethroned queens rarely fade quietly, and Camilla's next move would ignite a storm. Humiliated, stripped, and dethroned, Camilla did not scream. She waited. In silence, she crafted her revenge, gathering loyalists and whispering her truth to sympathetic ears. The woman once mocked as the other woman was now the queen in exile, preparing her counterstrike from the shadows. Behind the palace doors, she collapsed in grief, the weight of her humiliation pressing down harder than any scandal she had ever endured. Yet from the ashes of defeat rose a bitterness so sharp it threatened to consume her entirely. To Charles, she offered only a cold, strained civility. To Catherine, she showed nothing at all. But inside, she burned with a resolve that silence alone could not hide. Her bitterness grew with each passing day. She watched Catherine celebrated in newspapers, praised in headlines, adored in crowds. Every image of Catherine wearing Diana's jewels felt like a dagger. Every cheer from the public, a reminder of how far she had fallen. For Camilla, the humiliation was not just personal, it was public, merciless, and unrelenting. She had been queen in name, yet her husband had made it clear that the real power now lay in the hands of another woman. That betrayal, more than any insult from the outside world, hardened her heart. Camilla began to build her resistance quietly. Over private dinners and discreet gatherings, she called upon the allies who had once stood by her. Old friends from aristocratic circles, sympathetic courtiers who owed her favors, and members of her charitable network who still admired her work, became her confidants, her listeners, her pawns. At these meetings, the bitterness flowed freely, and the whispers turned into strategies. Though she had been stripped of power, she still knew the palace inside and out, and that knowledge became her weapon. Then came the leaks. Small at first, easily overlooked, but unmistakably targeted. Stories designed to chip away at Catherine's carefully constructed image began appearing in select newspapers. questions about her ambition, doubts about her motives, subtle reminders that she, too, was not born into royalty. It was a campaign of shadows, one Camilla never admitted to, but one everyone suspected. Each leak served a purpose not to destroy Catherine outright, but to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had so quickly embraced her as the future queen. And then, in one shocking act of symbolism, Camilla struck without a single word. At a public engagement, before cameras and an unsuspecting audience, she removed her crown and set it aside. The gesture was devastating in its quiet defiance. To some, it looked like surrender. To others, it was rebellion, a queen rejecting the throne that had betrayed her. That single moment, replayed endlessly in the media, sent shockwaves through the monarchy. It was not Catherine's triumph that dominated conversation, but Camilla's refusal to play the role she had been reduced to. What followed was a silence more dangerous than rage. Those closest to the monarchy began to sense that a confrontation was looming. Camilla's bitterness, her alliances, and her symbolic defiance had created a fracture that could not be ignored. Whispers of rebellion circulated once more, not in the streets, but within the very institution meant to project unity. The fragile balance Charles had hoped to preserve was slipping, and Catherine's crown, though gleaming, cast a long and ominous shadow. And so, as Catherine stood crowned in power and Camilla plotted in silence, the question burned brighter than ever. Was this truly the monarchy's rebirth, or its final descent into chaos? Britain has entered uncharted waters. A dethroned queen, a rising monarch in waiting, a king haunted by his legacy, and a royal family fractured by secrets. Catherine's crown is secure for now. But every crown forged in betrayal carries the weight of unfinished battles and the future of the call. Monarchy may depend on whether Catherine can hold her throne against ghosts, rivals, and fate itself. In the days that followed Charles's explosive declaration, the nation's voice was clear. Polls soared to unprecedented heights, with Catherine commanding levels of admiration not seen since Diana. Crowds gathered in her presence as though she already wore the crown, their chants and cheers drowning out every doubt. To the people, the monarchy had found its savior. Yet even the glow of public devotion could not erase the shadows lingering within the palace. Behind the facade of unity, whispers of abdication circled relentlessly. Charles, weary from illness and exhausted by the storm his decision had unleashed, appeared thinner, quieter, more withdrawn. Courtiers speculated that he was already contemplating the unthinkable, stepping aside while the nation still praised him for his boldness. If he did, Catherine's authority would expand even further, but so too would the dangers. For every abdication in history carried with it not just renewal, but rebellion, and the monarchy could ill afford another fracture. Within the family itself, the damage was visible. William stood resolute, but the weight of conflict with Harry hung heavy on his shoulders. Their brotherhood, once celebrated as the monarchy's promise of continuity, was now marred by suspicion and resentment. Harry's anger over Catherine's rise and Camilla's downfall had created a chasm wider than distance itself. Each attempted reconciliation collapsed into silence or fury, leaving Catherine trapped between her triumph and the family ties unraveling around her. The crown may have elevated her, but it had also deepened the wounds of those closest to her. Meanwhile, Camilla's loyalists were not silent. Though she had been cast aside, her influence had not been fully extinguished. Allies whispered of betrayal, quietly plotting ways to undermine Catherine's growing authority. These were not public rebellions, but subtle acts of resistance, stories planted in newspapers, gestures of defiance at public events, reminders that Camilla's shadow still stretched across the palace halls. They waited for Catherine to stumble, for her decisions to falter, ready to seize on any moment of weakness to reignite the fire of opposition. Beyond Britain, Catherine's image spread like wildfire. She became the face of modern royalty, her speeches shared globally, her demeanor hailed as a balance of grace and strength. Leaders across the Commonwealth began treating her as the monarch in spirit, if not in title. This global embrace was both her greatest weapon and her greatest risk. For while it elevated her above Camilla and even Charles, it placed her under a scrutiny more unforgiving than any crown could shield her from. The world would celebrate her success, but it would also magnify her failures. And so, the monarchy entered a new era, one defined not by ceremony, but by survival. Catherine stood at its center, adored yet exposed, celebrated yet challenged. Her crown gleamed with the light of renewal, but the cracks beneath it warned of storms yet to come. Camilla's silence was not surrender, Charles's frailty was not stable, and the brothers' fracture was not healing. All of it lingered, waiting for the right moment to erupt once more. And so, as the world watches, one truth remains. The crown is never safe. It must always be fought for, even within the walls of the palace itself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.